With Citlali's release drawing closer, and the recent leaking of Skirk possibly being a Cryo DPS, it goes to show that Hoyoverse has not quite forgotten Cryo, especially with Snezhnaya being closer than ever before. But given Cryo's current state, is there any way to actually bring Cryo back from the depths of despair? That's what I'll be asking in this video. So, what's wrong with Cryo? Why is it in such a bad spot? When you frame the question in the way of why is Cryo bad, you are going to have a hard time finding an answer. It has decent reactions and a good resonance. What could be so wrong with it? Well, the characters need to be able to use that element to a good degree, and that's where it currently fails. This also partially has to do with the limited release of Cryo characters. The most recent Cryo 5-star we got was Wriothesley, someone who had a good idea and completely fumbled it. Being a carry that leaned more towards Melt rather than the classic Freeze that Cryo was known for was an excellent step in the right direction. The issue comes with when we look at the execution. Wriothesley is horrendous to manage at C0. Melt is a big fan of boosting one big hit. Just a shame that Wriothesley's biggest hit has a 5-second cooldown. And not just that, when you play with Bennett, you straight up can't access it if he's on a good healing build. The fact that you have to tailor your Bennett's healing to specifically function exactly with Wriothesley's mechanics is enough of a chore on its own. If we look at the other Cryo characters to release around that time, we have only Charlotte. She was good because she could heal for Farina, and that's it. She was just a pure healer, something infamous for being bad. Then we got Mika in 3.5, a physical buffer. I doubt I have to explain why that's bad. The most recent Cryo character after that? Shenhe. Yep. Wriothesley, Charlotte, and Mika were the only additions we got to the Cryo roster since the reign of Freeze. The issue with Cryo does not come from the element itself, rather it was Hoyo's complete refusal to give it some attention. When we think about how to save an element, the first thing we have to look at is what's already there to build upon. So what does Cryo get right? Well, the first thing I want to look at is its reactions. Superconduct, Freeze, and Melt are perhaps the ultimate epitome of bad, mid, and good. Superconduct, even after its recent buff, does not have good damage that it's worth building for, which leaves us with its utility. The utility in question? Reducing physical resistance. Ah, incredible, because physical is such a good element, right guys? To be fair to the physical believers, even Geo was made good eventually thanks to Navi and Shalonen. This is because they gave the Geos the sheer numbers to look past their element's shortcomings. But this didn't fix the element, they just became good characters of that element. So Superconduct is entirely reliant on the current state of physical, which is bad. Freeze is unique. When it works, oh boy it works. When we got an entirely freezable Abyss back in 5.1, Ayaka did pretty well. The issue is that these kinds of abysses only happen once in a blue moon nowadays. Freeze is like Venti. When it works, it does really well, but it doesn't work that often. Now for the final Cryo reaction, Melt. Melt is by far the best reaction that Cryo has to offer, and yet Hoyo refuses to give it some love. At least, they did before Citlali, but even then, she can only buff the Pyro Melt users, not the Cryo ones. Still, she is a step in the right direction. So what is it exactly that makes Melt so powerful? Well, I could go on a rant about how multiplicative reactions are powerful, but all we really have to do is dissect its much more appealing brother Vaporize. Vaporize and Melt are essentially the same reaction. If we use the family analogy again, think of Vaporize as the older twin, who was given a scholarship for his favorite school, as well as winning a free car. Meanwhile, Melt is stuck in community college and rides a bike. Did that make sense? Probably not. To explain, Vaporize just had a lot more options given to it by Hoyoverse. At launch, we were gifted with Xingqiu, eventually followed by Yelan and even Farina. Characters that have high damage outputs, and in the case of the latter two, damage buffing as well. This made Pyro characters able to Vaporize very easily. Hydro characters getting the benefit of Vaporize was not fully explored until Mualani, but even before her, we saw Child hitting large numbers with his burst. Melt on the other hand, it's been entirely abandoned. While we did have Ganyu for Melt, she was far from perfect. Keep in mind that when Ganyu released, she was seen as an insanely strong DPS. The issue is that over time, she was not given more to work with, and by the time that she was getting more, she had already been long forgotten and power crept. The effort was just no longer worth the damage. By the time that we got Nahida for burn melt teams, you might as well just run Ohatham with that Nahida. And then when we got Emily, Kinich was coming right after, and not that many people even have Emily. Melt was never allowed to thrive. Well, until Citlali, that is. Citlali may not buff the Cryo DPSs, but she does allow for characters to finally run forward melt, with forward melt even being one of the strongest comps for Mavuika and Arlecchino. Citlali with Cinder City and her Res Shred boosted this archetype into the meta after being unused for the entire game's lifespan. Even then, for some teams her Cryo application is not high enough to do it on its own. But this is fine, since double Cryo is not a horrible idea. Even if it was, missing one melt doesn't kill the team. We're also getting Mavuika, a Pyro sub DPS who has actual buffing within her kit. The second Hoyo gave us a tool to boost melt with, we got to see melt become top tier. I've glazed melt enough at this point, but is there any way for us to save Freeze specifically? Well, much like melt, it suffers the same problem of not getting any new toys since Charlotte, and that was not even an upgrade over the Shenhe Kokomi core in Freeze's main target demographic, which is AoE content. But what if Freeze wasn't restricted to AoE? What if it could handle bosses as well? Yep, I'm suggesting a rework to Freeze to make it work on bosses. I know it sounds stupid, but trust me, balancing this is possible. All we have to do is for it to make it have a slowdown effect rather than a complete freeze. This preserves Freeze's ease of use factor, while not completely annihilating all sense of difficulty. As long as this effect still triggers Blizzard Strayer, Freeze would be a lot more favorable. But this alone wouldn't save Freeze. Obviously, we'd need new DPS characters to capitalize off of this. Speaking of which, this brings us to Skirk. A new Cryo DPS obviously leads to the new additions that Cryo obtained being fully utilized. And with Skirk being very popular, oh yeah, Hoyo does not want her to fail. So what direction will she take? Since her release is slated for 5.7, that still counts as the Natlan era, maybe preparation for 6.0. This means it can honestly go either way, Melt to promote Mavuika or Freeze for a potential 6.0 meta team. I can see Melt as more likely personally, given Freeze already having its time in the sun. Or I guess out of the sun, since otherwise it would melt. Oh hey, Melt reference. If my hypothesis on her being a Melt DPS is correct, there are obviously some things she would need to do. First of all, in order to maintain high Pyro Aura, she would need low application and yet one big hit of Cryo damage that will be consistently melting. Mualani is a very extreme example of how to make Melt and Vape work. Thanks to her attacking very slowly, but also very hard, she can easily keep up Pyro Aura, allowing her to vape all of her hits. The same principle applies to a Melt DPS, but for Cryo Melt, it's less harsh. Additionally, thanks to Kazo and Shalonen, and also Mavuika Burst if you count it, we need some off-field Cryo application. A big issue Ganyu faces is her setups for VV and Shalonen are really harsh. So if Skirk wants to avoid this, she needs to be able to have setups that don't want you to tear your brain out. For the rest, it's really simple. Just good numbers. The teammates are all there to make Melt work. We just need that final piece. I'm happy that Hoyo is giving Cryo some more action, especially since the Cryo characters in question are two characters that I like personally. Obviously, Cryo would get a resurgence during Snezhnaya, but now we see those first steps towards that future. Do you think Cryo is cooked, or are you optimistic about its future? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe. If you want to enter a discussion with me, be sure to message me on Twitter or join my Discord. Both are linked in the description. But that'll be it from me. Peace!